The morning Keith Brandt discovered his chickens roosting on his neighbor's roof for the third time that week. He stood in his muddy yard with his daughter on his hip and wondered if the birds had lost their minds or if he had lost his. "Daddy, they are up there again," Marisol said, pointing with the confidence of a 4-year-old who had spotted the obvious before her father. Her brown curls bounced as she wriggled in his arms. "I see them, Mary." Keith set her down and ran a hand through his hair, leaving it standing up in dark spikes. The sun was barely cresting the hills, and he still had to milk the cow, fix the gate hinge, and somehow get breakfast into his daughter before she turned into a whirlwind of hunger-fueled chaos. The cottage next door had been empty for 2 years, ever since old Martin died. Then a month ago, an orc woman had moved in. Keith had seen her once from a distance, tall and broad-shouldered, carrying furniture inside by herself. He had not introduced himself. He had his hands full enough without adding neighborly obligations to the list. But now his chickens seemed determined to make her acquaintance whether he liked it or not. He was halfway to the property line when the door of the neighboring cottage opened and the orc woman stepped out. She was younger than he had thought from the distance, maybe in her mid-20s, with green skin that caught the early light and small tusks that protruded just past her upper lip. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and she wore a simple work dress that showed muscular arms. She looked strong but not hulking, built like someone who worked hard for a living. "Good morning," she called, her voice deeper than a human woman's but not harsh. "I believe these are yours." She had 2 chickens tucked under one arm and was climbing down from her roof with the casual ease of someone descending a staircase. Keith watched, bemused, as she landed lightly in her yard and walked toward the fence that separated their properties. "Third time this week," Keith said, taking the chickens from her. One of them, a speckled hen he had named Trouble, clucked indignantly. "I do not know what has gotten into them. I fixed the coop fence twice." "Perhaps they like the view from up there," the orc woman said. Her eyes were amber, warm and bright in the morning sun. "I am Lyra Thornfield. I moved in last month. Keith Brandt, this is Marisol." He gestured to his daughter, who had toddled up behind him and was now staring at Lyra with undisguised fascination. "You are green," Marisol announced. "Mary, we do not." "I am," Lyra said, crouching down to Marisol's level. "Is that all right?" Marisol considered this gravely. "I think it is pretty, like the forest." Something softened in Lyra's expression, a warmth that made her seem less like a stranger and more like someone who understood the peculiar honesty of children. "Thank you. I like your curls. They bounce when you move." Marisol beamed and immediately began bouncing to demonstrate. "I am sorry about the chickens," Keith said, shifting his weight. The hens were getting heavy and Trouble was trying to peck his hand. "I will reinforce the fence again." "It is no trouble," Lyra said, straightening up. "Really, I was awake anyway." There was something in the way she said it, a carefulness that suggested she wanted to say more but was holding back. Keith was too tired to parse it. He nodded his thanks, gathered his daughter, and headed back to his cottage with the wayward chickens protesting under his arms. Behind him, he did not see Lyra watching him go with an expression that was half hopeful, half resigned. The next morning, the chickens were on Lyra's roof again, and the morning after that. Keith stood in his yard on the 5th consecutive morning, staring at his flock arranged like feathered gargoyles along Lyra's roofline, and felt something snap inside him. "That is it," he muttered. "I am rebuilding the entire coop." "But Daddy," Marisol said from her perch on the porch steps, "Miss Lyra does not mind." "That is not the point, Mary. They are our chickens. They should stay in our yard." He spent the entire day dismantling the chicken coop and rebuilding it with taller fences, tighter wire, and a roof that the birds could not possibly escape. It was hot work, and he was drenched in sweat by the time he hammered the last nail. Marisol brought him water and played in the dirt nearby, narrating an elaborate story involving stick figures and a ladybug. Lyra appeared at the fence line in the late afternoon, carrying a basket. "You have been working hard," she said. Keith wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "Hopefully this will keep them contained." "I brought bread," Lyra said, holding up the basket. "I baked too much this morning and thought you might like some." The smell hit him then, warm and yeasty and utterly wonderful. Keith's stomach growled audibly. He had forgotten to eat lunch. "You did not have to do that," he said, even as he walked to the fence. "I wanted to." Lyra handed him the basket, her fingers brushing his for just a moment. Her hand was warm and calloused, the hand of someone who worked with them. "And I wanted to say that I do not mind the chickens. Really. They are quite entertaining." "They are a nuisance," Keith said, but he took the basket. Inside were 3 perfect loaves of bread, golden and still slightly warm. "Miss Lyra," Marisol came running, her dress covered in dirt. "Did you bring food?" "I did. Bread, fresh this morning." "Can we have some now, Daddy, please?" Keith found himself nodding, too hungry and too tired to argue. "Go wash your hands first." Marisol scampered off, and Keith looked at Lyra. "Thank you. This is kind." "It is just bread," Lyra said, but she smiled and her tusks caught the light. "I will let you get back to your work." She turned to go, and Keith found himself saying, "The chicken-proof coop. Do you think it will work?" Lyra glanced back at him, and there was something playful in her expression, something that made her seem younger and lighter. "I suppose we will find out tomorrow morning." The next morning, 3 chickens were on Lyra's roof. Keith stood in his yard, staring at them, and felt a laugh bubble up in his chest before he could stop it. It was absurd. He had spent an entire day building a fortress of a coop, and somehow the chickens had still escaped. Marisol, standing beside him in her nightgown, giggled. "They really like Miss Lyra." "Apparently," Keith said. Lyra emerged from her cottage moments later, as if she had been waiting. She looked up at the chickens, then over at Keith, and her expression was so carefully innocent that he felt the first stirring of suspicion. "I see your fortress had some flaws," she called. "I see that." She climbed up to retrieve the chickens with the same easy competence as before, and Keith found himself watching the way she moved, efficient and sure-footed. She was strong, he could see that, but there was a grace to her movements that surprised him. "I think they have adopted me," Lyra said when she brought the chickens over. "Perhaps you should let them visit. I do not mind the company." "That is not how chickens work," Keith said, taking the birds from her. "They are supposed to stay where you put them." "Perhaps your chickens are unconventional." "That is one word for it." Marisol tugged on his pant leg. "Daddy, can Miss Lyra come for breakfast? We have her bread." Keith opened his mouth to decline politely, but Lyra spoke first. "I would not want to intrude," she said, but there was a hopeful note in her voice that she did not quite hide. "You are not intruding," Marisol said firmly. "We have lots of bread. You made it." Keith looked at his daughter, then at Lyra, and felt the weight of exhaustion and loneliness press down on him. When was the last time another adult had sat at his table? When was the last time he had shared a meal with anyone other than a 4-year-old? "We would be glad to have you," he heard himself say. "It is the least I can do after you keep retrieving my wayward flock." Lyra's smile was like sunrise breaking over the hills. "I would like that very much." Breakfast was simple. Eggs from the non-wandering chickens, fried potatoes, and Lyra's bread toasted over the fire. But sitting at the table with Lyra across from him and Marisol chattering between them, Keith felt something ease in his chest, a tightness he had not even realized was there. "How long have you been here on your own?" Lyra asked, keeping her voice casual as she buttered a piece of toast. 2 years, Keith said. He did not elaborate and Lyra did not push. It is a good property, she said instead. Well kept. I try. Keith poked at his eggs. It is a lot of work for one person. I imagine so. I am finding the same with my place. The previous owner let things slide in his final years. Martin was a good man, but he was old. If you need help with repairs, I can lend a hand when I have time. I would appreciate that, Lyra said. She hesitated, then added, and if you ever need help with Marisol or with anything here, I am just next door. Keith looked up at her, searching her face for pity or judgment, but found only genuine offer. Why? He asked bluntly. Why what? Why are you being so kind? You do not know us. Lyra met his gaze steadily. Because we are neighbors, because kindness costs nothing, because your daughter is delightful and you look like you could use a friend. The honesty of it hit him harder than flowery words would have. Keith swallowed past something in his throat and nodded. Thank you. Besides, Lyra said, her tone lightening, someone needs to keep an eye on those chickens. Marisol giggled, and the moment passed, but something had shifted. The wall Keith kept around himself had developed its first small crack. After that morning, the chickens continued their inexplicable escapes. Keith would wake each day to find at least 2 or 3 of them roosting on Lyra's roof, and each day Lyra would retrieve them and bring them back. Sometimes she stayed for breakfast. Sometimes she just handed them over with a smile and a few words of greeting. But she was always there, steady as the sunrise, and slowly Keith found himself looking forward to those morning encounters. Marisol adored Lyra. She would run to the fence whenever she saw their neighbor outside, chattering about her games and her dolls, and the story Keith had read her the night before. Lyra listened with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed children, asking questions and laughing at Marisol's jokes. Miss Lyra knows so many things, Marisol informed Keith one evening as he tucked her into bed. She knows about plants and animals and stars. Does she? Yes, she is very smart and she is nice. I like her. I like her too, Keith said, and realized as he said it that it was true. The seasons began to turn, summer sliding toward autumn. The mornings grew cooler, and the leaves on the trees started to blush red and gold. Keith's crops came in, and he spent long days harvesting and preserving, trying to put away enough food to see them through the winter. One morning, he found Lyra mending the section of fence between their properties. "What are you doing?" he asked, walking over with a mug of coffee in his hand. "Fixing the fence," Lyra said without looking up. "This panel was loose. I thought I would repair it before it fell over entirely." "That is my fence. It is on the property line. I consider it a shared responsibility." She drove a nail home with 3 efficient strikes of the hammer. "Besides, I was out here anyway." Keith watched her work, noting the sureness of her movements, the way she had already cut the wood to the right length and angle. "You know what you are doing. My father was a carpenter. I learned young." She glanced up at him, squinting against the morning sun. "I like working with my hands. It is satisfying, seeing something broken become whole again." "I know what you mean." Keith took a sip of his coffee. "Thank you. You did not have to do this." "I know." Lyra returned her attention to the fence, but he saw the small smile on her lips. The chickens, predictably, were on her roof again. Keith shook his head and went to collect them, but when he climbed up to Lyra's roof, he paused. From up here, he could see both properties spread out below. His tidy fields and garden, her cottage with its flower boxes, the forest beyond. It was a good view. "Maybe the chickens were onto something. See anything interesting up there?" Lyra called from below. "Just stubborn chickens and a nice view." "I told you they liked it up there." Keith gathered the chickens and climbed down, and when he reached the ground, Lyra was holding out a mug of coffee. I made extra, she said. You always make extra. Perhaps I am optimistic. They stood together in the cool morning, drinking coffee and watching the sun climb higher, and Keith felt the crack in his wall widen a little more. The day Marisol got sick, Keith felt the old panic rise in his throat. She woke with a fever and a cough, her small face flushed and her eyes too bright. Keith pressed his hand to her forehead and felt the heat radiating from her skin. "Daddy, my throat hurts," she whispered. "I know, sweetheart. I am going to take care of you." He spent the morning doing everything he could think of. Cool cloths on her forehead, honey in warm water for her throat, keeping her comfortable in bed. But the fever would not break, and Marisol grew more listless as the hours passed. Keith was preparing to ride to the village for the healer when he heard a knock at the door. Lyra stood on his porch, her face etched with concern. "I have not seen you or Marisol all morning. Is everything all right?" "Mary is sick," Keith said, and heard the strain in his own voice. "Fever and cough. I was about to go for the healer." "May I see her?" Keith hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside. Lyra followed him to Marisol's small room and knelt beside the bed. She placed a hand on the child's forehead, then felt along her neck and looked at her throat. "When did the fever start?" Lyra asked. "This morning, maybe 6 hours ago, and the cough, dry. She says her throat hurts." Lyra nodded slowly. "I am not a healer, but I have seen this before. It is likely just a fever from the changing season. Children get them. But I have some herbs that might help." "Herbs?" "Elderflower and peppermint for the fever, honey and thyme for the throat. My mother taught me." Lyra looked up at him, and her amber eyes were steady and calm. "I can make a tea if you trust me." Keith looked down at his daughter's flushed face and made a decision. "Yes, please." Lyra left and returned within a quarter hour with a basket of herbs and a jar of honey. She worked in Keith's kitchen with quiet competence, boiling water and steeping the herbs, adding honey and a little lemon. The cottage filled with a soothing, aromatic smell. "This should help," Lyra said, bringing the mug to Marisol's room. "Can you sit up for me, sweetheart?" Marisol managed to prop herself up on her pillows, and Lyra helped her drink the tea in small sips. "It tastes good," Marisol said, her voice hoarse. "I am glad. Drink as much as you can." While Marisol finished the tea, Lyra showed Keith how to make more, measuring out the herbs and explaining the proportions. "Give her this every few hours," Lyra said. "Keep her cool but not cold. The fever should break by evening or tomorrow morning. If it does not, then you should get the healer." "How do you know all this?" Keith asked. "I grew up in a small clan. We had a healer, but she was often away, tending to others. My mother made sure we all knew basic herb lore. It has come in handy." "Thank you," Keith said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I was so worried." "She will be all right," Lyra said gently. "She is a strong little thing." Lyra stayed through the afternoon, helping Keith tend to Marisol and taking over the chores he could not leave his daughter to do. She fed the chickens, collected the eggs, and even started dinner, a simple stew that filled the cottage with warmth. By evening, Marisol's fever had indeed started to break. She fell into a natural sleep, her breathing easier, and Keith felt the knot in his chest finally loosen. "You should eat," Lyra said, ladling stew into a bowl and pressing it into his hands. "You should too." Keith gestured to the chair across from him. They ate together in the quiet cottage, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional murmur from Marisol's room. Keith felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost hurt. "I do not know how to thank you," he said finally. "You do not need to thank me. This is what neighbors do." Lyra paused, then added softly, "This is what friends do." Keith looked at her across the table, this orc woman who had appeared in his life a few months ago and had somehow become essential to it. Her green skin glowed in the firelight and her eyes were warm and kind. "Friends," he repeated. "Yes, I suppose we are." Lyra smiled, and Keith felt the crack in his wall widen into something that might eventually become a door. The morning after Marisol recovered, Keith found not 3 but 7 chickens on Lyra's roof. He stood in his yard and laughed, a real laugh that came from deep in his belly. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was the best thing he had seen all week. Marisol, fully recovered and bouncing with renewed energy, clapped her hands. They all wanted to visit Miss Lyra, apparently. Lyra emerged from her cottage and looked up at her roof, now thoroughly colonized by poultry. "I think they are staging a coup," she called. "I think you might be right. At this rate, you should just move the coop to my property. Do not tempt me." They gathered the chickens together, Lyra handing them down from the roof and Keith collecting them below. It took 3 trips to get them all back to his coop, and by the end, they were both laughing. "I have a theory," Keith said as they secured the last chicken in the coop. "Oh, I think they know you have been sneaking them treats." Lyra's eyes widened in exaggerated innocence. "I would never." "You absolutely would. I have seen the way they follow you around. They are very friendly chickens. They are opportunists who know a soft touch when they see one." Lyra grinned, unrepentant. "Perhaps." Keith shook his head, but he was smiling. "You have created monsters. I have created well-fed, happy chickens. There is a difference." They walked back to the fence line together, and Keith found himself reluctant to say goodbye and return to his work. The morning was beautiful, crisp and clear, and Lyra's presence beside him felt right in a way he did not want to examine too closely. "I was thinking," Lyra said as they reached the fence, "that I might replace some of the shingles on my roof before winter. Would you be willing to help? I can trade labor for labor. I noticed your barn door needs rehanging." "You notice that?" "I notice a lot of things." There was something in her tone, a warmth that made Keith look at her more closely. She met his gaze steadily, and for a moment the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. "I would be happy to help," Keith said. "When were you thinking?" "This weekend. If the weather holds." "This weekend," Keith agreed. As Lyra walked back to her cottage, Keith watched her go and wondered when, exactly, his neighbor had become the best part of his days. Saturday dawned bright and cool, perfect weather for roof work. Keith left Marisol with a basket of toys on Lyra's porch, where she could play while they worked, and climbed up to help Lyra replace the damaged shingles. "Some of these are from Martin's time," Lyra said, prying up a rotted shingle. "Or before. They should have been replaced years ago." "He was old and had no family to help him," Keith said. "I should have checked on him more often." "You had your hands full. You cannot blame yourself for not doing more." Keith hammered a new shingle into place, the rhythmic sound satisfying. "My wife used to say that I could not carry the whole world on my shoulders." It was the first time he had mentioned her, and he felt Lyra's attention sharpen, though she did not stop working. "She sounds wise," Lyra said carefully. "She was. She died 2 years ago, fever in the winter. It came on fast, and by the time I got the healer it was too late." Keith's voice was flat, reciting facts to keep the pain at bay. "Marisol does not remember her much. She was only 2. "I am sorry," Lyra said quietly. "That is a hard thing to carry." It is." Keith drove a nail home harder than necessary. "But we are managing. We have to." "You are doing more than managing. You are raising a wonderful child. She is easy to love." They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the hammer strikes and the distant call of crows. Keith felt the weight of his confession settle between them, but it did not feel uncomfortable. It felt like a burden shared, lightened by speaking it aloud. "My clan did not approve of me moving here," Lyra said after a time. They said humans would not accept me, that I should stay where I belonged. What made you come anyway? I wanted a life that was my own. I wanted to see if I could build something for myself without the weight of expectations and old grudges. Lyra glanced at him, her expression wry. So far it has been good, quiet, peaceful. Except for the chickens. The chickens are the best part. Keith laughed, surprised by the admission. Are they? They give me an excuse to come over every morning. I like that. The honesty of it struck Keith silent. He looked at Lyra, really looked at her, and saw the hope in her amber eyes, the careful vulnerability. She was not just being a good neighbor. She was trying to be part of his life, slowly and steadily, in whatever way he would allow. I like it too, he said, his voice rough. I look forward to it, to seeing you. Lyra's smile was brilliant, brighter than the autumn sun. Good, then I will keep collecting your chickens. Even if they stop escaping, especially then, I will just have to find another excuse. They finished the roof as the sun reached its peak, and Keith rehung Lyra's barn door while she made lunch. Marisol helped, or thought she was helping, handing Keith tools and chattering about the family of mice living in the barn. Can we keep them, Daddy? She asked. The mice? No, sweetheart. They belong in the barn, not in our house. But they are so cute. They are also very good at chewing through grain sacks. Trust me, they are happier where they are. Lyra called them in for lunch, and they ate at her table this time, a simple meal of bread, cheese, and cold roasted chicken. Keith looked around Lyra's cottage as they ate, noting the small touches that made it a home. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a colorful quilt draped over a chair, books stacked neatly on a shelf. You have made this place nice, he said. Thank you. It is coming together slowly. Lyra poured water for Marisol. I want to plant a garden next spring. Vegetables and herbs, maybe some flowers. Miss Lyra, will you plant sunflowers? Marisol asked. I love sunflowers. Then I will absolutely plant sunflowers. Keith watched the easy affection between his daughter and his neighbor, and felt something warm bloom in his chest. Marisol had taken to Lyra from the start, but seeing them together now, seeing how Lyra listened to his daughter's every word as if it mattered, made him realize how much Marisol had been missing without a mother figure in her life, and how much he had been missing, too. The thought unsettled him, and he pushed it aside. He had survived 2 years on his own. He did not need anyone else. He was doing fine. But as he looked at Lyra, her head bent close to Marisol's as they discussed the merits of different flowers, he wondered if maybe fine was not enough anymore. October brought colder winds and shorter days. Keith spent his mornings collecting his chickens from Lyra's roof and his evenings preparing for winter. He chopped wood, repaired leaks, and reinforced the barn against the coming snows. Lyra helped when she could, appearing at his fence line with tools or an extra pair of hands. She was good at this, Keith realized, at offering help without making him feel like he needed it, at fitting herself into the spaces in his life without demanding more than he was ready to give. But he was ready. He was starting to realize to give more. One evening, after Marisol had gone to bed, Keith found himself standing at his window, looking at the warm light spilling from Lyra's cottage. He thought about walking over, about knocking on her door and just talking. But he was not sure what he would say, or if she would welcome an evening visit. So he stayed where he was. The next morning, 4 chickens were on Lyra's roof, and one was sitting in her windowsill as if it owned the place. Keith stood in his yard and pressed his hands to his face, torn between laughter and despair. They are getting bold, Lyra said, opening her door. The chicken in the windowsill clucked at her. This one has been watching me make breakfast. I think she is judging my cooking. That is Henrietta. She judges everything. Well, Henrietta, I will have you know my scrambled eggs are excellent. The chicken clucked again, skeptical. Keith climbed up to collect the chickens from the roof, and when he came back down, Lyra was holding Henrietta and scratching under her chin. "I think you have made a friend," Keith said. "She is warming up to me." Lyra handed Henrietta over. "Or she is playing a long game for more treats. Probably the treats." They stood together in the cool morning, and Keith found himself saying, "Do you ever get lonely? Living out here by yourself?" Lyra looked surprised by the question, but she considered it carefully before answering. "Sometimes, but less than I expected. I have good neighbors, one good neighbor, one very good neighbor." Lyra's smile was soft, "and his daughter and his chickens." "The chickens are questionable. I like them anyway." Keith shifted his weight, the chickens protesting under his arms. "I get lonely too," he admitted. "I did not think I would. I thought keeping busy would be enough. But there are nights when Marisol is asleep and the house is quiet, and I feel like I am the only person in the world." "You are not," Lyra said quietly. "I am right here." The simple statement hit Keith harder than any flowery declaration could have. She was right here. She had been right here for months, steady and kind and patient, waiting for him to see what was right in front of him. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I am starting to realize that." Something flickered in Lyra's eyes, something hopeful and cautious. "Good," she said softly. They stood there for a long moment, the chickens forgotten, the world narrowed down to just the two of them. Keith wanted to say more, wanted to reach across the small distance between them and take her hand, but he did not know how. It had been so long since he had reached for anyone. Marisol's voice calling from the cottage broke the spell. "Daddy, where are you?" "I should go," Keith said. "Yes." Lyra stepped back, giving him space. "I will see you tomorrow." "Tomorrow," Keith agreed. As he walked back to his cottage, the chickens tucked under his arms, he felt the last of the wall around his heart begin to crumble. November arrived with frost on the ground and ice in the water trough each morning. Keith's chickens, undeterred by the cold, continued their daily migrations to Lyra's roof. But now Keith suspected the truth. He had started waking earlier, before the sun rose, and one morning he crept to his window and watched. In the pre-dawn darkness, he saw a figure move through his yard, quiet as a ghost. Lyra, with a pocketful of grain, scattering it near the coop and leaving a trail toward her cottage. She was luring the chickens over. Keith watched as the chickens, ever opportunistic, followed the trail of grain. Lyra herded them gently toward her roof, using a long stick to encourage them up. Within minutes, they were settled on her rooftop, and Lyra disappeared back into her cottage. Keith stood at his window, his heart pounding, and felt a smile spread across his face. She had been doing this all along. Every single morning, Lyra had been stealing his chickens just to have an excuse to bring them back, just to see him and talk to him and slowly, carefully, work her way into his life. She had fallen for him first, and she had been patient enough to wait for him to catch up. Keith returned to bed and pretended to sleep until Marisol woke him, and when he went outside to discover his chickens on Lyra's roof, he acted surprised. "Again," he called to Lyra when she emerged. "I am starting to think they are doing it on purpose," she called back. "Or someone is helping them." Lyra paused halfway up her roof and her eyes met his. There was a flicker of alarm in them, quickly hidden. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. "Nothing, just a theory." Keith kept his expression neutral. "I will come get them." When he climbed up to Lyra's roof, she was waiting, the chickens gathered around her feet. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "That you have been luring them over since this morning?" Lyra's face flushed a darker green and she looked away. "I am sorry, I know it was foolish. I just wanted an excuse to see you and I did not know how else to." "Lyra." She stopped, looking at him with wide, vulnerable eyes. "I am not angry," Keith said. "I am grateful. Grateful you woke me up. Not literally, but close enough. I have been going through the motions for 2 years, just trying to survive. Then you moved in next door and started stealing my chickens, and suddenly, I had something to look forward to in the mornings. I had someone who saw me, not just as Marisol's father or the widower trying to hold his farm together, but as a person. Keith took a step closer to her. You have been patient with me, kind. You have been exactly what I needed, even when I did not know I needed it. Keith, Lyra whispered, and there was so much hope in her voice that it made his chest ache. I am not good at this, Keith said. I have not courted anyone since I was a boy courting my wife. I do not know the right words or the right gestures. But I know that I look forward to seeing you every morning. I know that Marisol adores you and that you are wonderful with her. I know that when I think about the future, you are in it. Lyra's eyes were bright and she blinked rapidly. You mean that? Every word. I was so afraid you would never see me that way, that you would only ever see me as the neighbor, the orc. I see you, Keith said firmly. I see Lyra, who is kind and smart and strong, who makes incredible bread and knows herb lore and can fix a fence better than I can. Who steals my chickens because she is too shy to just knock on my door, he smiled. Though I do wonder why you did not just knock. Because I was terrified you would send me away, Lyra said, her voice breaking. Humans and orcs, we are not supposed to. People would not. I do not care what people think, Keith said. I care about you. If you will have me, I would like to court you properly. Spend time together, see where this goes. Lyra let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and nodded. Yes. Yes, I would like that very much. Keith closed the distance between them and took her hand. It was warm and strong, and it fit perfectly in his. Then let us start with breakfast, together. No chickens required, though they are welcome to join if they want. I think they have earned it, Lyra said, smiling through her tears. They climbed down from the roof together, hand in hand, and when Marisol saw them walk into the cottage together, she clapped her hands and said, Finally. Keith laughed and scooped his daughter up. Finally what? Finally, you are holding hands with Miss Lyra. I have been waiting forever. Have you now? Yes, you like each other, I can tell. Keith looked at Lyra, who was trying not to laugh, and shook his head. You are too smart for your own good, Mary. I know, Marisol said happily. They had breakfast together, the three of them and a few chickens who had wandered in, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Courting Lyra was nothing like courting had been when Keith was young. There were no chaperones or formal visits, no need to follow the rules of polite society. They were adults, living next door to each other, and they courted in the spaces between daily life. Keith helped Lyra prepare her cottage for winter, insulating the walls and sealing the drafts. Lyra taught Marisol how to braid her hair and told her stories about the orc clans in the north. They had dinner together most evenings, trading off between the two cottages, and Keith found himself talking about things he had not spoken of in years. His childhood, his dreams, his fears. Lyra listened to all of it with the same steady patience she brought to everything, and she shared her own stories in return. She told him about growing up in a clan that valued strength above all else, about being the quiet one who liked books and plants more than fighting. She told him about the prejudice she had faced, both from humans who saw her as a monster and from orcs who saw her as weak. I am neither, she said one evening as they sat by Keith's fire, Marisol asleep upstairs. I am just me, but it took me a long time to believe that. I am glad you came here, Keith said, reaching for her hand. I am glad you decided to build a life for yourself. I am glad, too. Lyra laced her fingers through his. Even if it means dealing with your ridiculous chickens. They are your chickens now, too. I suppose they are. The first snow fell in late November, blanketing the world in white. Keith woke to find his chickens on Lyra's roof again, but this time he knew she had not lured them. The birds had simply decided, in their infinite chicken wisdom, that Lyra's roof was their preferred roosting spot. He walked over to collect them and found Lyra standing in her yard, looking up at the chickens with a bemused expression. "I did not call them this time," she said when she saw him. "I believe you. I think they have genuinely adopted me. It appears so." They collected the chickens together, and afterward, Keith found himself lingering in Lyra's yard, reluctant to leave. "Stay for breakfast," Lyra said, as if reading his mind. "I should get Mary up and start the chores. Bring her over. We can have breakfast together and I will help with the chores after." Keith looked at her, this strong, patient woman who had somehow become the center of his world, and made a decision. "Lyra, I love you." The words came out abruptly, unpolished, but they were true. Lyra froze, her eyes going wide. "You what? I love you," Keith repeated, steadier this time. "I have been falling for you since the first day you brought my chickens back, maybe before that. I just did not realize it until recently. Keith." Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "I love you too. I have loved you for months. I know, or I suspected." Keith stepped closer, cupping her face in his hands. Her skin was cool from the morning air, and he felt her shiver at his touch. "Thank you for waiting for me." "I would have waited longer," Lyra said, her eyes bright. "I would have waited as long as it took." Keith kissed her then, a gentle press of lips that tasted of promise and new beginnings. Lyra made a soft sound and leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. When they broke apart, they were both smiling. "We should tell Marisol," Keith said. "She is going to say she told us so. She absolutely is." They walked back to Keith's cottage hand in hand, and when they told Marisol over breakfast that Keith and Lyra loved each other and were going to be together, the little girl's response was immediate and enthusiastic. "Does this mean Miss Lyra will live with us?" she asked, her eyes shining. "Eventually," Lyra said, glancing at Keith. "If that is what everyone wants." "I want it," Marisol said. "I want it so much." "Then we will make it happen," Keith said. "But it will take time. We have to do things properly." "What does properly mean?" "It means we have to plan and talk. And make sure we are all ready." Marisol considered this gravely. "Okay, but not too long, right?" "Not too long," Keith promised. Winter settled in with snow and cold winds, but Keith's cottage had never felt warmer. Lyra was there most days, helping with Marisol, cooking meals, mending clothes. She fit into their lives as if she had always been there, and Keith marveled at how natural it all felt. The people in the village noticed, of course. When Keith went to market with Lyra and Marisol, he felt the stares, heard the whispers. Some people were merely curious. Others were openly disapproving. "Is it true you are courting the orc woman?" one of the village men asked bluntly one day. "I am," Keith said, his voice steady. "Her name is Lyra." "That is not right," the man said. "Humans and orcs do not mix." "Then it is a good thing I am not asking your permission." Keith took Marisol's hand and walked away, his jaw tight. Lyra was waiting at the edge of the market, and he could see from her expression that she had heard. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "You have nothing to apologize for." Keith set his purchases down and took both her hands. "People will talk, let them. It changes nothing. It might make things hard for you, for Marisol. Marisol is happy. I am happy. That is all that matters. And if people refuse to trade with you, if they make your life difficult, then they are fools and I will find other people to trade with." Keith squeezed her hands. "I am not giving you up because of small-minded bigots. You understand?" Lyra's eyes were bright with tears, but she nodded. "I understand. Good, now let us go home." They walked back to the farm together, Marisol between them holding both their hands, and Keith felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. He would shield his family from the world's cruelty. He would build a life for them where they were safe and loved. And if the world did not like it, the world could look away. Christmas came with deep snow and clear skies. Keith cut down a small pine tree and set it up in his cottage, and Marisol decorated it with strings of berries and bits of ribbon. Lyra contributed ornaments she had carved from wood, small animals, and stars that caught the firelight beautifully. "This is my first real Christmas," Lyra said as they admired the tree together. "My clan did not celebrate it." "Then we will make it a good one," Keith said. He had carved a wooden horse for Marisol and spent hours sewing a new doll dress. For Lyra, he had made something more personal. A small wooden box with a lid that fit perfectly, smooth and warm to the touch. Inside, he placed a pressed flower from Lyra's garden, a feather from one of the chickens, and a note that simply said, "Thank you for seeing me." On Christmas morning, Marisol tore through her presents with glee, and Lyra opened hers more slowly, her hands trembling slightly. When she read the note, she looked up at Keith with tears in her eyes. "I will always see you," she said. "Always. I know." Keith leaned over and kissed her softly. "Merry Christmas, Lyra, Merry Christmas." Lyra's gift to Keith was a new coat, warm and well-made, with pockets deep enough for tools or grain or whatever he needed to carry. She had sewn it herself, and the stitches were neat and even, the work of someone who cared about every detail. "I noticed your old coat was wearing through," she said. "I wanted you to have something warm." Keith put it on and found that it fit perfectly. "Thank you. It is wonderful. You are welcome." They spent the rest of the day together, cooking a Christmas dinner and playing games with Marisol. The chickens wandered in and out, entirely unbothered by the celebration, and Keith thought that this warmth and laughter and love, was what he had been missing for so long. As winter stretched into January, Keith began to think seriously about the future. He and Lyra had been courting for 2 months now, and every day only confirmed what he already knew. He wanted her in his life permanently, but there were practicalities to consider. Lyra still lived in her own cottage, and while she spent most of her time at Keith's place, it was not official. They were not married, not even formally engaged, and Keith wanted to do this right. One evening after Marisol was asleep, Keith asked Lyra to sit with him by the fire. "I have been thinking," he said, taking her hand, "about us, about the future." "So have I," Lyra said softly. "I want to marry you," Keith said bluntly. "I want you to be my wife officially and permanently. I want us to be a family, you and me and Marisol." Lyra's breath caught. "Keith, I know it is fast. I know people will talk, but I do not care. I love you and I want to build a life with you. If you are willing." "I am willing," Lyra said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want that too, more than anything." Keith pulled a small ring from his pocket. It was simple, a band of silver with a small green stone set into it. He had bought the stone from a trader and had the blacksmith in the village set it for him. "It is not much," he said, "but the stone reminded me of your eyes." Lyra stared at the ring, tears streaming down her face. "It is perfect." Keith slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit as if it had been made for her. Lyra looked at it, then at him, and launched herself into his arms. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Keith said, holding her tight. "We are going to be happy, Lyra. I promise you that." They decided to marry in the spring, when the world was green and new again. Keith wanted to build a proper addition to the cottage first, a room for him and Lyra, so that Marisol could keep her own space. Lyra wanted to finish preparing her cottage to rent out or sell, to have some income of her own. But more than that, they wanted time to prepare Marisol, to make sure she understood what was happening and was happy about it. "Daddy is going to marry Miss Lyra," Keith explained one evening at dinner. That means she will be part of our family officially. She will live with us all the time. Marisol looked between them, her expression serious. Will she be my mama? Keith glanced at Lyra, who looked uncertain. I would never try to replace your mama, Lyra said gently. She will always be your mama and she loved you very much, but I would love to be part of your family if you will have me. Can I call you Mama Lyra? Marisol asked. Lyra's eyes filled with tears and she nodded. I would be honored. Then yes, Marisol said decisively. You can marry Daddy. Keith laughed, surprised by his daughter's authority, and Lyra wiped her eyes. Thank you, sweetheart, Lyra said. That means the world to me. Will the chickens be at the wedding? Marisol asked. Absolutely, Keith said. They are part of the family too. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting to reveal the muddy earth beneath. Keith spent his days building the addition to the cottage, working steadily through rain and cold. Lyra helped when she could, holding boards in place and fetching tools, and together they built something solid and warm. The new room had a large window facing east, so they could wake to the sunrise, and a fireplace to keep it warm in the winter. Keith built a bed frame from oak, sturdy and wide, and Lyra sewed curtains and a quilt in shades of green and gold. It is beautiful, Lyra said when it was finished. You built this for us. I built it for our future, Keith said, wrapping his arms around her. Everything I do now is for our future. The wedding was set for the 1st of May, a traditional spring wedding date. They would marry in the yard between their two cottages, with the village priest officiating and whatever neighbors chose to attend. Keith did not expect many to come, given the prejudice some held against orcs, but he was surprised. The baker came, and the blacksmith, and several of the families who farmed nearby. They brought food and well wishes, and if some of them were unsure about the match, they kept it to themselves. Lyra wore a dress of soft green, the color of new leaves, with flowers woven into her braided hair. She was beautiful, strong, and radiant, and Keith felt his breath catch when he saw her. Marisol was the flower girl, scattering petals with solemn concentration, and the chickens wandered freely through the crowd, pecking at the petals and generally causing chaos. The priest, an older man who had known Keith since he was a boy, spoke about love and commitment and the courage it took to build a life with another person. He did not mention Lyra's heritage, did not make any comment about the fact that she was an orc. He simply married them as he would any couple, with respect and warmth. Do you, Keith Brandt, take Lyra Thornfield to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do, Keith said, his voice strong and sure. And do you, Lyra Thornfield, take Keith Brandt to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do, Lyra said, her eyes shining. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Keith cupped Lyra's face in his hands and kissed her, and the small crowd cheered. Marisol clapped her hands, delighted, and the chickens clucked their approval. When they broke apart, Keith whispered, I figured out the chicken scheme long ago, you know. Lyra laughed, surprised. What? I have known for months that you were luring them over, but I let it happen because I liked having an excuse to see you every morning. You knew. Lyra stared at him, torn between laughter and disbelief. All this time, and you never said anything. I was waiting to see how long you would keep it up. Keith grinned. Turns out you are very dedicated. I cannot believe you, Lyra said, but she was laughing, her whole face alight with joy. You let me make a fool of myself. You were charming. You still are. They celebrated into the evening, eating and drinking and dancing in the yard. The sun set in shades of gold and pink, and the first stars appeared overhead. Later, when the guests had gone home and Marisol was asleep in her room, Keith and Lyra stood together in their new room, holding each other close. We did it, Lyra said softly. We are married. We are, Keith agreed. How does it feel? Like coming home. Keith kissed her forehead, then her lips, slow and tender. I love you, Lyra Brandt. I love you too, Keith Brandt. They climbed into their new bed together, and through the window they could see the stars and the dark outline of Lyra's cottage, soon to be rented to a young couple from the village. Should we keep luring the chickens over? Lyra asked sleepily. Absolutely. It is tradition now. Lyra laughed softly, and Keith held her close, and for the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. The weeks after the wedding settled into a new rhythm, one that felt both different and comfortingly familiar. Lyra moved her remaining belongings into Keith's cottage, though she kept a few things at her old place for the tenants who would arrive in the summer. The addition they had built together became their sanctuary, a place where they could retreat at the end of long days. Marisol adapted to the change with the resilience of children, delighting in having Lyra there all the time. She started calling Lyra Mama Lyra naturally, without prompting, and the first time she did it, Lyra had to excuse herself to cry happy tears in the kitchen. The chickens, predictably, continued their shenanigans. One morning in late May, Keith woke to find every single chicken in his flock perched on Lyra's old cottage roof. All 15 of them, lined up like feathered sentinels. I did not do that, Lyra said when they went to investigate. I swear I did not. I believe you, Keith said, staring at the improbable sight. I think they have just decided they like your roof better than anywhere else. Should we move the coop over there? Keith considered it. The cottage would be rented soon, but the barn beside it was empty. Actually, that is not a bad idea. The barn has good shelter and it is closer to the feed storage. And the chickens clearly have a preference. So they spent the next week building a new, improved coop in the barn beside Lyra's old cottage. It was larger than the old one, with proper nesting boxes and roosting bars and a door that actually latched securely. Not that it matters, Keith said as they hung the door. They will escape anyway. Probably, Lyra agreed, but at least they will have a nice home to escape from. When the coop was finished, they transferred the chickens over. The birds explored their new home with enthusiastic clucking, and by evening they had settled in as if they had always lived there. They seem happy, Marisol observed. They do, Keith said. That night, as Keith and Lyra lay in bed, Keith said, I have been thinking about something. Oh, Lyra turned to face him in the darkness. What if we deliberately left a gap in the fence, between the coop and our cottage, just a small one so the chickens can wander over when they want? Lyra was quiet for a moment, then laughed softly. You want to keep the tradition going. I want to make sure they always have a reason to visit, and if they end up on your old roof again, well, at least the new tenants will get a show. You are ridiculous. You love me anyway. I do, Lyra said and kissed him. Let us do it, a gap in the fence just for the chickens. And for us, Keith said, to remember how this all started. The next day they built the new fence and left a gap, just wide enough for a chicken to squeeze through. Marisol helped, handing them nails and chattering about how the chickens would have their own special door. Like a secret passage, she said. Exactly like that, Lyra agreed. By summer, the young couple moved into Lyra's old cottage. They were newly married themselves, farmers from the next valley over, and they were delighted to discover that the property came with occasional chicken visitors. They just wander over sometimes, Keith explained, showing them the gap in the fence. They are friendly. Just shoo them back if they are a bother. We do not mind, the young wife said. They are charming. That is one word for them, Keith said. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. Keith and Lyra worked the farm together, planting a large garden and tending the fields. Marisol grew like a weed, her legs getting longer and her face losing some of its baby roundness. She started helping with real chores, collecting eggs and feeding the chickens and pulling weeds in the garden. The people in the village grew accustomed to seeing Keith and Lyra together. The initial whispers and stares faded, replaced by grudging acceptance and, in some cases, genuine friendship. The baker started saving special treats for Marisol, and the blacksmith always had a kind word for Lyra when she came to town. There were still some who disapproved, who muttered about unnatural unions and the corruption of proper society. But Keith ignored them, and Lyra held her head high, and together they showed the world that love was not bound by species or tradition. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Lyra said, "I have been thinking about something." "What is that?" Keith was whittling a small wooden bird for Marisol, the shavings curling at his feet. "About children, our children." Keith's hand stilled. "You want to have a child." "I want to have your child," Lyra said carefully. "If you want that too. I know you already have Marisol and she is wonderful, but I would like to have a baby with you if you are willing." Keith set down his knife and the half-finished bird and turned to face her. "I would love that," he said. "I would love to have a child with you." Lyra's face lit up with joy. "Really, really. Marisol would be thrilled to have a sibling, and I think you would be an amazing mother." "I hope so," Lyra said softly. "I want to be." Keith took her hand and kissed it. "Then let us try. Let us build our family even bigger." By autumn, Lyra suspected she was pregnant. The village healer confirmed it in October, and when Lyra told Keith, he spun her around in the yard, laughing with pure delight. Marisol was equally thrilled. "A baby," she said, her eyes wide. "A real baby, a real baby," Lyra confirmed. "You are going to be a big sister." "I am going to teach them everything," Marisol declared. "How to collect eggs and how to pet the chickens gently and how to make flower crowns." "They will be lucky to have you," Keith said, pulling his daughter into a hug. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter. Lyra was sick in the mornings for a few weeks, but it passed, and by the time the snows came, she was glowing with health. Keith hovered, protective and attentive, and Lyra tolerated his fussing with patient amusement. "I am not fragile," she reminded him when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. "I know. But let me help anyway. You are sweet. Ridiculous, but sweet." The baby was due in late spring, and as the due date approached, Keith found himself both excited and terrified. He had done this before with Marisol, but it felt different now, more real somehow. "What if something goes wrong?" he asked Lyra one night. "Then we will handle it," Lyra said calmly. "Together. But nothing will go wrong. I am strong and the baby is healthy." "How do you know?" "I can feel it. Trust me." Keith did trust her, and he tried to let go of his fear. The baby came on a warm day in May, almost exactly a year after their wedding. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and when the midwife placed the baby in Lyra's arms, Keith felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "It is a boy," the midwife announced. Lyra looked down at their son, her eyes filled with wonder. He was small and perfect, with green-tinged skin and tiny tusks just barely visible. He had Keith's dark hair and Lyra's amber eyes. "Hello, little one," Lyra whispered. "What should we name him?" Keith asked, sitting beside her on the bed. They had discussed names over the winter but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at their son, Keith knew. "Alden," he said. "It means old friend, wise protector." "Alden," Lyra repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Alden Brandt. Can I see him?" Marisol asked from the doorway, where she had been waiting impatiently. "Of course, sweetheart. Come meet your brother." Marisol climbed onto the bed and peered at the baby with intense curiosity. "He is so small." "You were this small once," Keith said. "Was I green?" "No, you were pink and wrinkly." Marisol considered this. I like that he is green. He looks like Mama Lyra." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, and she kissed the top of Marisol's head. "Thank you, sweetheart." They spent the rest of the day together, the four of them, learning the rhythms of their new family. Alden was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in between. Marisol was fascinated by him, wanting to help with everything. And the chickens, as if sensing the new arrival, gathered outside the window and clucked softly, their own odd welcome. The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and tiny milestones. Alden grew quickly, his tusks becoming more prominent, his grip strengthening. He had Lyra's calm temperament and Keith's stubbornness, a combination that promised interesting things for the future. Marisol took her role as big sister seriously, singing to Alden when he fussed and bringing him flowers from the garden. She announced to anyone who would listen that she had a baby brother and he was perfect. The village's reaction to Alden was mixed. Some people were curious and kind, cooing over the baby and congratulating Keith and Lyra. Others were less welcoming, muttering about half-breeds and unnatural children. Keith ignored them with the practice of someone who had heard it all before. Lyra struggled more, her protective instincts flaring whenever someone looked at Alden with disapproval. "Let them talk," Keith said one evening when Lyra was particularly upset. "Alden is perfect and he is ours. That is all that matters. But what if he grows up facing prejudice? What if people treat him badly because he is half orc?" "Then we will teach him to stand tall and be proud of who he is," Keith said firmly. "He has the best of both of us, Lyra. He will be strong and kind and smart, and anyone who cannot see that is a fool." Lyra took a shaky breath and nodded. "You are right. We will teach him to be proud. And he will have Marisol to protect him. She is fierce when she wants to be." That made Lyra laugh. "She is not she, absolutely terrifying." As summer turned to autumn, their life continued in its comfortable rhythm. Keith and Lyra worked the farm together, with Marisol helping more and more as she grew older. Alden reached new milestones, rolling over and sitting up and babbling in a language only he understood. The chickens, still dedicated to their bizarre routine, continued to escape through the gap in the fence and wander over to visit. Sometimes they ended up on the roof of Lyra's old cottage, to the amusement of the tenants. Sometimes they just pecked around the yard, keeping Marisol company. One morning, Keith woke to find a chicken sitting on the windowsill of their bedroom, staring at him with beady eyes. "How did you even get up here?" Keith asked the chicken. It clucked, unrepentant. "What is happening?" Lyra mumbled, still half asleep. "Henrietta is on the windowsill." "Of course she is." Lyra rolled over and blinked at the chicken. "Hello, Henrietta." Henrietta clucked again, as if greeting her. "I think she missed you," Keith said. "I saw her yesterday. Maybe she wanted to check on the baby." As if summoned, Alden woke and began to fuss from his cradle beside the bed. Lyra picked him up and settled him against her shoulder, and Henrietta watched with apparent interest. "See, Alden, that is Henrietta. She is one of our chickens." Alden stared at the chicken with wide amber eyes, then made a gurgling sound that might have been laughter. "He likes her," Keith said. "Of course he does. He is your son." Keith laughed and climbed out of bed to usher Henrietta back outside. When he returned, Lyra was nursing Alden and the morning sun was spilling through the window, painting everything in gold. "I love our life," Keith said, sitting beside them. "So do I," Lyra said softly. "Even the ridiculous parts. Especially the ridiculous parts." By the time Alden was 6 months old, they had settled into a routine that felt both comfortable and joyful. Keith and Lyra were partners in every sense of the word, sharing the work and the responsibilities and the small pleasures of daily life. They had dinner together every evening, the four of them around the table, with chickens sometimes wandering through and Marisol chattering about her day. They told stories and sang songs and played games, building a family culture that was uniquely theirs. On Sundays, they walked to the village for the market, and Keith noticed that more and more people greeted them warmly. The baker gave Marisol extra cookies, and the blacksmith always asked after Alden. The tide was turning, slowly but surely, and their family was becoming simply another part of the community. One Sunday in late autumn, as they were walking home from the market, Marisol asked, "Daddy, you think Alden will have magic when he grows up? Magic?" Keith looked down at his daughter, puzzled. "Lily at school says orcs have magic, that they can talk to animals and make plants grow." Keith glanced at Lyra, who looked amused. "Some orcs have a gift for working with nature," Lyra said carefully. "It is not magic exactly, but a connection to the world around us. I have a little of it. That is why my garden grows so well." "Will Alden have it too? Maybe. We will have to wait and see." Marisol considered this gravely. "I hope he does. It would be useful." "It would," Lyra agreed, smiling. That winter was gentler than the previous one, with less snow and warmer days. Keith built a larger coop for the chickens, who had multiplied over the year, and Lyra prepared the garden beds for spring planting. Alden grew and thrived, his personality emerging more each day. He was a happy baby, quick to smile and slow to cry, and he adored his big sister with a devotion that made Marisol preen with pride. "He said my name," she announced one day in late winter. "He said Mary." "Are you sure?" Keith asked, though he did not doubt her. "Yes." "He was looking right at me and he said Mary." Lyra confirmed it. "He did. His first word." Marisol was insufferably proud for days. As spring returned and Alden approached his first birthday, Keith found himself reflecting on how much had changed in 2 years. He had gone from a lonely widower struggling to hold his life together to a man with a wife he adored, 2 children, and a home filled with warmth and laughter. "Thank you," he said to Lyra one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "For what?" "For being patient with me. For stealing my chickens. For loving me even when I was too broken to see what was right in front of me." Lyra leaned her head on his shoulder. "You were never broken, just grieving. There is a difference, maybe, but you put me back together anyway." "We put each other back together," Lyra corrected. "That is what love does." Keith kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of herbs and sunshine that always clung to her. "I am glad you moved next door. So am I, even if it meant dealing with your impossible chickens." "Our chickens," Keith corrected. "Our chickens," Lyra agreed, smiling. They sat together as the sun dipped below the hills and the stars began to appear, and somewhere in the distance, the chickens clucked softly, settling in for the night. Alden's first birthday was a joyous celebration. They invited the neighbors and the friends they had made in the village, and the yard filled with people and laughter and food. The chickens wandered freely, of course, stealing bits of food and generally causing chaos. Alden, dressed in a little blue outfit Lyra had sewn for him, sat in the grass and grabbed at everything within reach. His tusks were more prominent now, and his green skin had deepened to a shade closer to Lyra's. He looked like a perfect blend of both his parents, and Keith felt a surge of fierce pride every time he looked at his son. "He is beautiful," one of the neighbor women said, watching Alden try to eat a blade of grass. "Thank you," Lyra said, scooping Alden up before he could succeed. "He is curious about everything." "Just like his sister," the woman said, nodding toward Marisol, who was showing a group of children how to properly hold a chicken. "Exactly like his sister," Keith agreed. As the party wound down and the guests departed, Keith and Lyra sat on the porch with their children, Marisol leaning against Keith and Alden drowsing in Lyra's arms. "This is everything I ever wanted," Lyra said softly. "A home, a family, a place where I belong." "You belong here," Keith said. "You always will. I know." Lyra looked at him, her amber eyes warm. "Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for choosing me, for choosing us." They sat together as the evening deepened, watching the stars appear one by one. The chickens had settled in their coop, except for Henrietta, who had somehow made her way onto the porch railing and was watching them with her usual imperious expression. "Henrietta, you are supposed to be in the coop," Keith said. The chicken clucked, unimpressed. "Let her stay," Lyra said. "She is part of the family, too." Keith laughed and let it go. Henrietta ruffled her feathers and settled down on the railing, apparently satisfied. As the months passed, life continued in its gentle rhythm. Marisol started school in the village, a small building where children of all ages learned together. She was bright and curious, and she made friends easily, including several children who thought it was the coolest thing in the world that she had an orc for a stepmother and a half-orc baby brother. Alden grew from a baby into a toddler, walking and then running with the unstoppable energy of a child discovering the world. He followed Marisol everywhere, determined to keep up with his big sister, and she tolerated his presence with the patience of someone who genuinely loved her sibling. Keith and Lyra worked the farm together, their partnership so smooth it was as if they had been doing it for decades instead of just a few years. They planted and harvested, tended animals and mended fences, and built a life that was simple and good. The people in the village had fully accepted them now. Keith and Lyra were just another family, unusual perhaps, but no more so than the old woman who kept 30 cats or the farmer who insisted on talking to his cows. One day in late summer, when Alden was 2 and Marisol was 7, Keith stood in his yard and watched his family. Lyra was in the garden with Alden, teaching him the names of different plants. Marisol was in the chicken coop, collecting eggs and singing to herself. The sun was warm, the sky was clear, and everything was exactly as it should be. A chicken landed on the roof of the cottage, and Keith looked up at it and laughed. "Still at it, huh?" he called. The chicken clucked, and Keith swore it sounded smug. Lyra looked over from the garden, following his gaze to the roof. "Should we get her down?" "Nah, let her enjoy the view." Lyra smiled, that warm smile that had stolen his heart years ago, and returned her attention to Alden. Keith stood there for a long moment, taking it all in, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. This was his life. This was his family. And it had all started with a few determined chickens and an orc woman brave enough to steal them. He thought about the man he had been 3 years ago, exhausted and lonely and just trying to survive. He thought about the wall he had built around his heart and how Lyra had patiently dismantled it, brick by brick, with kindness and persistence and love. And he thought about the future stretching out ahead of them, full of possibility and promise. "Daddy," Marisol called from the coop. "Come see. One of the hens laid a blue egg." "A blue egg?" Keith walked over, curious. Sure enough, nestled in the straw was a small blue egg, pale as a robin's but unmistakably from a chicken. "How did that happen?" Marisol asked. "Some chickens lay blue eggs," Keith said. "It is a special breed. We must have one mixed in with the flock. Can we keep it, not eat it?" "We can keep it for a while, see if it hatches." Marisol carefully moved the egg to a separate nesting box, handling it like precious treasure. Keith watched her work, marveling at how much she had grown. "She is going to be a farmer," Lyra said, coming up behind him with Alden on her hip. "Just like you, maybe. Or maybe she will be something completely different, a scholar or a healer or a merchant. Whatever she becomes, she will be wonderful." Lyra shifted Alden to her other hip. "Just like this one." Alden grabbed at her braid, tugging it gently, and Lyra laughed. "You are lucky you are cute," she told him. "He gets that from me," Keith said. "Your humility is truly inspiring." Keith grinned and pulled her close, kissing her despite Alden's protests at being squished between them. When they broke apart, Marisol was watching them with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. "You two are always kissing," she said. "That is what people do when they love each other," Keith said. "I know, it is just weird. You will understand when you are older." "That is what you always say." "Because it is always true." Marisol rolled her eyes, an expression she had learned recently and used at every opportunity, and went back to tending the chickens. That evening, after the children were asleep, Keith and Lyra sat together in their room. Lyra was mending a shirt, and Keith was reading a letter from the land office about taxes. It was domestic and ordinary, and Keith loved every moment of it. "I have been thinking," Lyra said, setting down her mending. "About what?" "About how strange life is. How 3 years ago I was alone and unsure if I had made the right choice coming here, and now I have a husband and 2 children and a home I love." "You made the right choice," Keith said, setting aside the letter. "I am grateful every day that you did." "So am I." Lyra smiled. "Even though it meant resorting to chicken theft. Especially because of the chicken theft, it was creative." "It was desperate," Lyra corrected. "I did not know how else to talk to you. You seemed so unapproachable, so closed off." "I was," Keith admitted. "I had forgotten how to let people in." "But you learned again. Because you were patient enough to wait." Lyra reached for his hand, and Keith laced his fingers through hers. They sat together in comfortable silence, and Keith felt that same deep contentment he had felt earlier. "You ever regret it?" Lyra asked quietly. "Marrying me. The judgment from some people, the complications." "Never," Keith said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Lyra. You and our children, I would face down the whole world for you. You are a good man, Keith Brandt." "I am a man who got very lucky." "We both did." They sat together until the candle burned low, and then they climbed into bed and held each other close, grateful for the life they had built together. The years that followed were good ones. Marisol grew into a smart, confident girl who excelled in school and helped on the farm with enthusiasm. Alden grew into a cheerful, energetic boy who loved animals and could spend hours watching the chickens or playing with the barn cats. Keith and Lyra grew older together, their partnership deepening with each passing season. They faced challenges, of course, bad harvests and sick animals and the occasional bout of illness. But they faced them together, and that made all the difference. The chickens continued their antics, still finding ways to escape and end up in odd places. Henrietta lived to an impressive old age for a chicken, finally passing away peacefully when Alden was 5. They buried her in the garden, and Marisol planted a sunflower over her grave. "She was a good chicken," Marisol said solemnly. "The best," Keith agreed. More chickens came to replace her, of course, each with their own personality and quirks, but none were quite as imperious or determined as Henrietta had been. When Marisol turned 10, she announced that she wanted to learn carpentry like Lyra's father. "I want to build things," she said. "Like you and Mama Lyra built our room." Keith looked at Lyra, who looked pleased. "I can teach you," Lyra said, "if your father does not mind." "I do not mind at all," Keith said. "I think it is a wonderful idea." So Lyra began teaching Marisol the basics of woodworking, starting with simple projects and gradually moving to more complex ones. Marisol took to it naturally, her hands steady and her eye for detail keen. "She has talent," Lyra told Keith one evening. "Real talent. She gets that from you," Keith said. "She gets her stubbornness from you. I prefer to call it determination." Lyra laughed and kissed him, Call it whatever you like." Alden, watching his sister work with wood, decided he wanted to learn too. At 6, he was too young for most tools, but Lyra gave him his own small hammer and some soft wood to practice on. He spent hours pounding nails into boards, creating abstract sculptures that made no sense but filled him with pride. "Look, Daddy, I made a thing." "It is a very impressive thing," Keith said, examining the jumble of nails and wood seriously. "What is it?" "It is a chicken." Keith squinted at it. "Of course it is. I see it now." Alden beamed and ran off to show his mother. As the years continued to pass, Keith sometimes thought back to that first morning when he had found his chickens on Lyra's roof. He thought about how frustrated and bewildered he had been, and how he had never imagined that those wayward birds would lead him to the love of his life. "Do you ever miss your old cottage?" he asked Lyra one day as they worked in the garden together. "Sometimes," Lyra admitted. "But not in a sad way, just nostalgic. It was my first real home, the first place that was truly mine. We could buy it back from the tenants if you wanted. Their lease is almost up." Lyra considered it, then shook her head. "No, let someone else have it. We have everything we need here." "Are you sure?" "I am sure." Lyra straightened up, pressing a hand to her lower back. "This is our home, our family is here. That is all I need." Keith set down his hoe and pulled her into a hug, not caring that they were both covered in dirt. I love you too." Lyra rested her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for giving me this life. Thank you for choosing me." They stood together in the garden, surrounded by growing things and the distant sound of their children playing, and Keith felt complete. That fall, when Marisol was 12 and Alden was 8, they had a family meeting around the dinner table. "Your mother and I have been talking," Keith said, "and we want to know how you would feel about expanding the farm." "Expanding how?" Marisol asked. "We have been thinking about buying the land adjacent to ours," Lyra explained. "It is good land, and it would give us more room for crops and animals. And it would give us something to build together," Keith added. "A project for all of us." "I think it is a good idea," Marisol said after a moment. "We could use more space." "Can we get a goat?" Alden asked. "I want a goat." Keith and Lyra exchanged amused glances. "We can discuss goats," Lyra said diplomatically. "I am going to take that as a yes," Alden said happily. They purchased the land in the spring and spent the summer clearing it and preparing it for planting. It was hard work, but satisfying, and the whole family pitched in. Marisol helped build new fences, Alden cleared rocks and weeds, and Keith and Lyra worked together to plan the layout. By autumn, they had a functioning expansion, with new fields planted and a small barn built for additional animals. And yes, they got a goat, a mischievous creature that Alden named Bramble and loved with his whole heart. The chickens, of course, immediately colonized the new barn, finding the highest rafters to roost on. "They approve," Lyra said, watching the chickens settle in. "They would approve of anything as long as there is food involved," Keith said. "True." As they stood together, surveying their expanded farm, Keith felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was his legacy, the life he was building not just for himself but for his children and their children after them. "You think Marisol will take over the farm someday?" Lyra asked. "Maybe. Or maybe Alden will. Or maybe they will both do something completely different and we will have to sell it to someone else." Keith shrugged. "Whatever happens, I hope they are happy." "They will be," Lyra said confidently. "We are raising them right. We are raising them with love. The rest will figure itself out." When Marisol turned 16, she announced that she wanted to apprentice with the master carpenter in the village. "I want to learn more than you can teach me, Mama Lyra," she said apologetically. "You have taught me so much, but I want to learn everything." Lyra looked proud rather than hurt. "That is exactly what you should do. Master Thuron is the best carpenter in 3 valleys. If he will take you as an apprentice, you should go." "You are sure?" "I am sure. Go learn, make me proud." Marisol hugged her fiercely. "I will, I promise." The apprenticeship was arranged, and Marisol moved to the village to live with Master Thuron and his wife. She came home on Sundays, full of stories about the furniture she was learning to build and the techniques she was mastering. Keith missed her terribly, but he was proud of her independence and drive. Alden, meanwhile, showed no interest in leaving the farm. He loved the animals and the land, and he spent his free time exploring the forest and learning about the plants and creatures that lived there. "He has the gift," Lyra said one day, watching Alden coax a wild rabbit to eat from his hand. "The connection to nature, it is strong in him." "Like you," Keith said, "stronger. He will be able to do things I never could." "Is that dangerous?" "No, just powerful," Lyra smiled. "He will do good things with it. I am sure of that." Keith trusted her judgment, and he watched his son with pride and wonder as Alden grew into his abilities. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and milestones. Marisol completed her apprenticeship and opened her own carpentry shop in the village, quickly gaining a reputation for beautiful, sturdy furniture. Alden stayed on the farm, working alongside Keith and Lyra and becoming an expert in animal husbandry and crop cultivation. When Keith turned 50, he started to think about slowing down. His back ached more than it used to, and the long days of farm work were harder to recover from. "Maybe we should hire some help," he said to Lyra one evening. "Or maybe we should let Alden take over more of the work," Lyra suggested. "He is 20 now, more than capable, I know. I just hate the idea of not being useful. You will always be useful, and you have earned the right to rest more." Lyra took his hand. "We have worked hard for 30 years, Keith. It is all right to slow down." Keith nodded, knowing she was right. "When did we get old?" "I do not know. It snuck up on us." They laughed together, and Keith felt grateful for every year, every gray hair, every ache and pain that marked a life well lived. Alden did take over most of the daily farm operations, and he did it with enthusiasm and skill. He expanded the farm even further, adding new crops and experimenting with sustainable farming techniques that improved the land rather than depleting it. "He is better at this than I ever was," Keith admitted one day. "He learned from the best," Lyra said, "and then he made it his own." Marisol got married when she was 25, to a kind man who worked as a teacher in the village. They had a small wedding in the same yard where Keith and Lyra had married, and the chickens attended, of course. "Some traditions are worth keeping," Marisol said, laughing as she shooed a chicken away from the cake. 2 years later, Marisol and her husband had a daughter, and Keith became a grandfather. The baby had dark hair and brown eyes and absolutely no orcish features, but Keith loved her with the same fierce devotion he had loved his own children. "She is perfect," he said, holding his granddaughter for the first time. "She is," Marisol agreed. "And I have you and Mama Lyra to thank for showing me what a good family looks like." Keith's eyes stung with tears, and he kissed his daughter's forehead. "You are a good mother. You always will be." Alden married a few years later to a human woman from a neighboring farm. She was practical and hardworking, and she fit into the family as if she had always been there. They had 2 sons in quick succession, both with the green-tinged skin and small tusks that marked them as part orc. "They are going to be heartbreakers," Lyra said, holding her grandsons. "They are going to be trouble," Keith corrected, "just like their father." "I was not trouble," Alden protested. "You absolutely were. You just charmed your way out of consequences." The grandchildren filled the farm with noise and energy, and Keith and Lyra settled into their roles as grandparents with contentment. They told stories and taught skills, and spoiled the children just enough without undermining their parents. One evening, when Keith was 60 and Lyra was 58, they sat on their porch and watched the sun set over the farm they had built together. "We did good," Keith said. "We did," Lyra agreed. "Do you have any regrets?" "About what?" "Anything. Your life. Your choices." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, considering. "No," she said finally. "I do not. Everything I have, everything I am led me here, to you, to our family. How could I regret that?" "I do not regret anything either," Keith said, "except maybe not seeing what you were doing with the chickens sooner." Lyra laughed, the sound warm and rich. "You figured it out eventually." "I did, and I am glad I let it continue." "So am I." They sat together as the stars appeared, and Keith thought about the thread of their lives, woven together by chance and choice and a flock of determined chickens. It was a good story, a happy story, and he was grateful to have lived it. A chicken, descended from Henrietta's line, landed on the porch railing and clucked softly. "Hello, troublemaker," Keith said. The chicken ruffled its feathers and settled down, and Keith and Lyra sat together in the gathering dark, their hands clasped, and their hearts full. The farm continued to thrive, generation after generation, a testament to the life Keith and Lyra had built together. And somewhere, in the strange logic of the universe, a few chickens always found their way to the roof, keeping alive the tradition that had started it all. Years later, when Keith was very old and his hair was completely white, he walked through the farm with his great-grandchildren following behind him like ducklings. They asked him questions about everything, their young minds hungry for knowledge and stories. "Grandpa Keith, why do the chickens always go on the roof?" one of them asked. Keith smiled, thinking of Lyra, who was resting inside after a long day. "Because a long time ago, a very smart woman decided that chickens on a roof were the perfect way to talk to a stubborn man." "That does not make sense," the child said. "It does not have to make sense. It just has to work." Keith ruffled the child's hair, and it worked better than anything else could have. The children ran off to play, and Keith stood alone in the yard for a moment, looking at everything he and Lyra had created. The farm stretched out around him, prosperous and well-maintained. The cottages, old and new, housed multiple generations of family. And somewhere, a chicken was probably on a roof, continuing the tradition. Keith smiled and walked back inside, where Lyra was waiting with tea and a warm fire. They sat together as they had for more than 30 years, comfortable in the silence and the love that had only grown stronger with time. "I love you," Keith said, as he had said 1,000 times before. "I love you too," Lyra replied, as she always did. And outside, the chickens settled in for the night, their work done, their legacy secure. The farm would continue, the family would grow, and somewhere in the future, someone would ask why chickens always ended up on roofs, and the story would be told again. A reminder that love could start in the most unexpected places and grow into something that lasted forever. Keith and Lyra lived out their days in happiness and peace, surrounded by family and the land they loved. And when they were very old, they would sit on their porch and watch the chickens wander freely. And they would remember the beginning of their story, when a few determined birds had brought two lonely people together and changed everything. It was a good life, a full life, and neither of them would have changed a single moment of it. The chickens kept ending up on the roof, generation after generation, and so did the love that had started with them. It became a family tradition, a story passed down, a reminder that sometimes the best things in life start with something as simple and silly as a chicken on a roof, and the courage to knock on a neighbor's door. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The love they had built, the family they had raised, and the legacy they would leave behind, as enduring as the farm itself, and as surprising and delightful as those first escaped chickens had been so many years ago.